The air was crisp, the sky painted in hues of amber and violet as a young girl galloped across the open field. Suddenly, the sharp crack of a gunshot shattered the serenity. Shadow, a sleek black horse with a radiant coat, staggered and collapsed, its once powerful legs folding beneath it. A high-pitched scream tore through the countryside, the voice of 12-year-old Amira Jones, who stood frozen in horror. The scene was pure chaos. Shadow lay motionless, Amira's tears streaming as she knelt beside her beloved companion, and in the distance, the figure of an armed officer stood rigid, his gun still smoking. What could possibly drive a trained law enforcement officer to pull the trigger on an innocent child's cherished horse? This wasn't just a senseless act of violence, it was a moment that would ignite a storm of outrage, a legal battle that would transcend state lines, and a public reckoning with deeper truths about race, justice, and authority. This is not just Amira's story, it's the story of a nation forced to confront its biases. The question remains, what really happened that day in the countryside, and why? Amira Jones, a vibrant 12-year-old black girl with a heart full of ambition, always found solace in the gentle rhythm of Shadow's hooves. To her, Shadow was more than just a horse, he was her partner, her confidant, and her gateway to a dream that seemed bigger than the world she knew. Shadow, formerly named Midnight before Amira gave him a name she felt matched his soul, was her pride and joy. Together, they shared a bond that couldn't be broken. Amira's dream was to defy stereotypes in the world of competitive equestrianism, a sport often dominated by privilege and exclusivity. She envisioned herself atop the podium, not just as a rider but as a symbol of resilience and possibility. She believed that she and Shadow could prove that talent and determination outweighed tradition and expectation. On that particular morning, the countryside seemed alive with hope. The field stretched endlessly, the golden grass swaying in the wind. Shadow's sleek form moved gracefully under Amira's steady hands as she guided him through their routine. Laughter escaped her lips as she envisioned the future, a world where she and Shadow would conquer obstacles together, breaking barriers with every leap. But in a matter of seconds, that idyllic scene would transform into a nightmare, forever altering Amira's life and her understanding of the world around her. The tranquil morning air was abruptly disturbed by the sound of tires crunching over gravel. A police vehicle came into view, and Officer Mark Evans stepped out, his demeanor rigid, his presence unwelcome. Amira glanced up from where she stood with Shadow, her face a mix of confusion and curiosity. She knew this land well, it was her family's property, passed down through generations. But Officer Evans didn't seem interested in that fact. Striding toward Amira with an air of authority, Mark's gaze fixed on her, sharp and unrelenting. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his hand resting on the holstered weapon at his side. Amira stood her ground, her voice calm but firm. "This is my family's land, sir. I'm practicing with my horse." She gestured to Shadow, who stood a few feet away, his dark coat glistening under the sun. Mark's brow furrowed. "I've had reports of trespassing in the area," he said flatly. "You need to leave." "But I'm not trespassing," Amira replied, her heart pounding. "This is my home." The tension thickened. Mark's tone grew sharper as he insisted she leave the property, ignoring her explanations. Shadow, sensing the unease, began to shift nervously, his ears flicking back. Mark took a step closer, his presence invasive, and that's when Shadow reared up, startled by the escalating tension. Amira instinctively reached for the reins to calm him, her soothing voice barely audible over her own growing fear. But in that moment, Mark's hand shot to his weapon. Without hesitation, he pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot rang out, deafening and final. Shadow let out a pained cry, his powerful legs buckling as he crumpled to the ground. Amira's scream echoed across the field, her knees giving way as she dropped beside her beloved horse. Tears streamed down her face as she pressed her hands against Shadow's neck, willing him to move, to stand, to breathe. But it was too late. Shadow's glossy eyes stared blankly into the distance, his chest heaving one final time before going still. Amira's world shattered in that instant. The bond she had with Shadow, the dreams they had shared, were gone. All that remained was the cold, unrelenting presence of Officer Mark Evans, his gun still raised, and a justification already forming on his lips. Amira's sobs pierced the stillness that followed the gunshot. Her hands trembled as she stroked Shadow's lifeless body, her heart breaking with every second that passed. Then her grief turned to rage. She stood, her tear-streaked face contorted with fury, and turned to Mark. "Why did you do that?" she demanded, her voice trembling but strong. Shadow wasn't doing anything wrong. Mark, his posture defensive, holstered his weapon and folded his arms. He reared up. He was out of control. "I had to act. It was protocol." "Protocol?" Amira's voice rose, disbelief dripping from every word. "He was scared because of you. You didn't have to shoot him." Before Mark could respond, the sound of hurried footsteps interrupted them. James Jones, Amira's father, emerged from the nearby house, his face a mixture of concern and barely contained anger. He took in the scene, the officer, the weapon, and most painfully, the lifeless form of Shadow lying in the dirt. James approached with measured steps, his eyes locked on Mark. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with an unmistakable edge. Mark straightened, his authority faltering slightly under James's unyielding gaze. "Sir, your daughter's horse became a threat. I followed protocol to ensure everyone's safety." James's jaw tightened, his fists clenched at his sides. "A threat," he repeated slowly. "That horse was a part of our family. My daughter has trained him for years. You call this ensuring safety?" Mark shifted uncomfortably, his confidence cracking under James's steady questioning. "It was an accident. I didn't mean for it to escalate like this," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. James stepped closer, his presence towering, his voice unshakable. "An accident doesn't erase what you've done. You took something precious from my daughter today. And you're going to answer for it." Mark opened his mouth to reply but faltered. The weight of his actions and the unrelenting determination in James's eyes left him momentarily speechless. The confrontation hung heavy in the air, the tension thick enough to cut. Amira stood silently by her father's side, her grief giving way to a growing sense of resolve. Shadow's death would not be in vain. James's calm yet forceful demand for accountability was just the beginning of a battle that would soon unfold, a battle for justice, for answers, and for the truth behind why Mark had felt the need to pull the trigger on a day that was supposed to be filled with hope. The days following Shadow's death felt like a storm brewing over the small town. News of the incident spread rapidly, and soon, it wasn't just a local tragedy, it was a flashpoint. The town, already quietly simmering with unspoken racial tensions, erupted into heated debates. On one side were those who believed Mark's actions were justified, citing protocol. On the other were those who saw the incident as a glaring example of systemic bias. Amira, however, was not interested in the noise. Her grief transformed into an unshakable resolve. Shadow had been more than a horse to her, he had been a symbol of her dreams, her hard work, and her determination to break barriers in a sport where faces like hers were rarely seen. She wasn't just seeking justice for Shadow, she was standing up for herself, for her family, and for what was right. Amira began documenting everything, the way Mark had approached her, his dismissive tone, and his refusal to listen to her explanations. With her father's support, she reached out to community leaders and activists, determined to make sure that Mark's actions would not go unanswered. Meanwhile, Mark Evans faced his own fallout. His father, Judge Richard Evans, was one of the most respected legal minds in the state, serving on the Supreme Court. The news of his son's actions hit him like a freight train. For Richard, the situation was a nightmare, both as a father and as a judge. Late one night, Richard sat alone in his study, the dim glow of a desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. In his hands was the report detailing Mark's version of events. He read it over and over, the words blurring together as his mind wrestled with a moral dilemma. On one hand, Mark was his son. As a father, his instinct was to protect him, to shield him from the growing storm of public outrage. But as a judge, Richard was bound by the law, by his own lifelong commitment to justice. How could he reconcile the two? The town waited with bated breath as whispers of a possible lawsuit began to circulate. For Amira and her family, this wasn't just about the loss of Shadow, it was about accountability, about showing that no one, not even a police officer, was above the law. For Richard, it was about something much larger. He knew that the choices he made in the days ahead would define not just his career but his legacy. As the weight of his position pressed down on him, Richard made a decision, one that would soon shake the foundations of the courtroom and test the bonds of family, justice, and truth. The courthouse was packed, every seat filled with members of the community. Some were there to support Amira and her family, while others came out of curiosity, eager to witness the trial that had captivated the town. At the center of it all sat Amira, her young face determined but weary. Her family's lawsuit against Officer Mark Evans had turned into a high-profile case, drawing attention from media outlets across the state. Cameras flashed as Amira and her father entered the courtroom, their heads held high despite the weight of the moment. Presiding over the trial was none other than Judge Richard Evans. His face was impassive, his emotions carefully masked as he took his seat at the bench. The room buzzed with the irony of the situation. Mark's own father would be the one deciding his fate. The trial began with opening statements. Amira's attorney painted a vivid picture of the events leading up to Shadow's death, emphasizing the emotional and cultural significance of the horse to Amira. "This is not just about a horse," the attorney declared. "This is about a young girl's dreams being shattered and the abuse of power that led to it." Amira took the stand next, her small frame seeming to grow as she recounted the events of that day. Her voice trembled at first, but she steadied herself, describing every detail with clarity and courage. The courtroom was silent as she spoke, her words painting a vivid picture of the bond she had shared with Shadow and the heartbreak of losing him. "Shadow wasn't just a horse," she said, her voice cracking. "He was my best friend. He was my chance to prove that I belonged, that I could succeed in a world that wasn't made for girls like me." The community's support for Amira was palpable. People of all races and backgrounds filled the courtroom, a testament to the unity her fight for justice had inspired. Outside, protesters held signs demanding accountability, their chants echoing through the courthouse walls. Mark's defense, however, painted a very different picture. His attorney focused on his years of service and his claim that he had acted out of fear. Officer Evans was faced with a rapidly escalating situation, the defense argued. His actions, while tragic, were not malicious. They were a split-second decision made under immense pressure. Mark himself took the stand, his voice defensive as he tried to justify his actions. "I didn't want to shoot the horse," he said. "But when it reared up, I thought it was going to charge. I had to protect myself." But the courtroom's attention kept drifting back to Judge Richard Evans. His expression was unreadable, his internal conflict hidden behind a stoic mask. As his son testified, Richard's gaze didn't waver, but the weight of the moment was evident in the lines on his face. The trial reached its climax as closing arguments were made. Amira's attorney implored the jury to see past the uniform and recognize the abuse of power that had taken place. "This isn't just about one incident," they said. "It's about ensuring that justice is served, no matter who the defendant is." As the jury deliberated, all eyes turned to Judge Evans. Would he allow his personal ties to influence the case? Or would he uphold the principles he had spent his entire career defending? The tension in the room was palpable, every breath held as the weight of justice hung in the balance. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that made every creak of a chair or shuffle of papers echo like thunder. All eyes were fixed on Judge Richard Evans as he entered the room, his robe flowing behind him like a shadow. He took his seat, his face a mask of composure, though his slightly trembling hands betrayed the inner storm brewing within. The jury filed in, their expressions unreadable. Amira clutched her father's hand, her palms clammy, her heart racing. Mark sat at the defendant's table, his face pale, his jaw clenched. He avoided his father's gaze, staring instead at the polished wood of the table before him. The foreperson stood and announced the jury's decision. We find the defendant, Officer Mark Evans, guilty of misconduct. Gasps rippled through the room, and a wave of relief washed over Amira. She felt tears welling up, her father squeezing her hand in quiet reassurance. But the moment everyone was waiting for came next. Judge Richard Evans leaned forward, his voice steady yet heavy with emotion. Today, I must deliver a judgment not only as a judge, but as a father. It is one of the most difficult moments of my life. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. Mark Evans, you failed in your duty as a protector of this community. Your actions were reckless, driven not by protocol, but by bias and poor judgment. The consequences of your decision have caused immeasurable pain to an innocent girl and her family. As your father, it breaks my heart to see you here. But as a judge, I have no choice but to hold you accountable. His voice cracked for a moment before he steadied himself. You are hereby ordered to pay restitution to the Jones family, and your actions will result in a permanent mark on your record. I hope that this serves not only as justice for Amira, but also as a lesson for us all, that no one is above the law. As the gavel fell, the courtroom erupted into a mix of quiet sobs and murmurs. Amira's father wrapped his arms around her, and for the first time since Shadow's death, she allowed herself to feel a glimmer of hope. Justice had been served, not fully, but enough to start healing. Mark sat frozen, his father's words ringing in his ears. He wasn't just a disgraced officer now, he was a man who had to face the consequences of his actions. In the days following the trial, the town seemed different. Shadow's death had left a scar, but it also ignited something powerful, a determination to confront the unspoken prejudices that had lingered for far too long. People of all backgrounds began to come together, organizing community forums and rallies. What had once divided them was now becoming a cause to unite them. Amira, now 13, stood at the edge of the paddock where she used to train with Shadow. The place felt emptier without him, but it wasn't devoid of meaning. Shadow had been more than a horse, he had been a catalyst for change. Amira reflected on the journey that had brought her here, on how Shadow's loss had pushed her to stand up, not just for herself, but for others who had faced similar injustices. Shadow taught me more than how to ride, she said softly, her voice carried away by the breeze. He taught me how to stand tall, even when the world tries to bring you down. Meanwhile, Mark began his own journey toward redemption. The trial had forced him to confront not just his actions, but the deep-seated biases that had shaped his decisions. Stripped of his badge and burdened by the weight of his father's words, Mark took steps to make amends. He started volunteering with organizations that worked to bridge racial divides and began speaking publicly about the mistakes he had made. In one of his talks, Mark addressed a group of young officers. Fear is not an excuse, he said, his voice firm yet tinged with regret. We're entrusted with the power to protect, and that means we must confront our own biases before we can confront the world's problems. For Amira, life moved forward, though Shadow's memory remained a constant presence. She continued training, now with a new horse gifted to her by the community as a sign of their support. Every gallop across the field felt like a tribute to Shadow, a testament to her resilience and determination. At her first competition after the trial, Amira stood proudly at the starting line, her heart full of nerves and excitement. She could almost hear Shadow's steady breaths beside her, as if he were still cheering her on. She smiled, gripping the reins tightly. As the buzzer sounded, she whispered, "This is for you, Shadow." And as she rode, the crowd's cheers filled the air, a symbol of a community moving forward, one gallop at a time.